May I begin by congratulating my honourable friend for Regent's Park and Kensington North for managing to secure this debate on this really important subject, and to thank her for the very kind words that she said today, although I think are completely undeserved, and for many new members being able to come into this place and find members of Parliament such as Karen Bath, into whose slipstream we can fall, is something that is of enormous assistance. And obviously, such comments also, of course, are richly applied to my right honourable friend, the representative for Camberwell and Peckham as well, for all the work that she's done in fighting for leaseholders. It is really important that the poor are represented strongly in Inner London by Inner London members of Parliament, and it is fantastic to be able to fall in with such a strong team. I've had a very large number of letters and emails from leaseholders telling me about this debate today, because they do feel that no matter how strongly they try to explain the difficulties that they are suffering, they don't feel that their case is being represented strongly enough, because they don't feel that anything is happening. And there is enormous frustration. If I could perhaps begin with just painting a picture of Islington, and I apologise for having to begin by doing this, but I do find that people tend to assume something about Islington which is only partially true. People know Islington as being leafy lanes and Georgian squares and coffee shops and the media. And it's because the media live in the leafy lanes and the Georgian squares and spend their time in the coffee shops, and they don't spend a great deal on the other side of the road, on the estates of Islington. Nearly half of the people who live in my constituency live in council estates or former council estates. And the average income of people living in council properties is £5,000 a year, according to the Housing Needs Survey. The average income of people living in housing association estates is £6,000 a year, and though the average income of people living on the streets is £40,000 a year plus. And unfortunately, my constituency is one where, when a poor person moves out of a social housing in Islington, an even poorer and more desperate person moves in, because in order to be able to get the properties which are increasingly in demand, they need to be so desperate as to get sufficient points to be able to be rehoused. And equally, when a rich person moves out of one of the streets in Islington, an even richer person moves in, because now the housing prices are such that a small flat in Islington is £300,000, and that is 10 times the average income of a Londoner. So what is going to happen to my constituency in the years to come, I hate to think, because we don't have the people in the middle, and the leaseholders actually very often represent those in the middle and are a very important part of my constituency. I strongly believe in mixed communities. We really need to be able to work together and to be able to live together. I'm proud of the fact that my constituency is as mixed as it is, but economically we are becoming increasingly divided. It isn't just a picture of the rich tending to live in the streets and the poor tending to live on the estates, because of course what happened in the 1980s, and whilst one famous and indefatigable political leader nationally was selling off council properties, another famous and strong-minded and indefatigable leader on Islington Council was buying up street properties on behalf of Islington Council. And the Honourable Lady for Barking was buying, at the time as leader of the council in Islington, and was buying street properties on the open market and turning them into social housing. So we have a mixture. We have some people in social housing who live in the streets, and now we have a number of people who are leaseholders who live on the estates. And of course what seems to have happened is when I moved into my street, which is a street in Islington, nearly half of the properties were owned by the council and were social housing. And over the 14 years that I've been living there, they've all been sold, and it's now all private housing. So there's movement. But the core of I think the best way to explain the fundamental injustice that people feel in Islington, leaseholders feel in Islington, about the way in which they are being charged is this, and I'll explain it in this way. I do believe that over the time when the Conservatives were in charge of this country, they did leave the estates in Islington and elsewhere to rot. They did not invest in them in the way they should, and the conditions of the estates were absolute disgrace. The state of the lifts, of the stairwells were quite disgusting and where people were not being treated with sufficient respect, and the level of investment that was needed was not something that a Labour council could by itself invest in, unfortunately. That sort of investment has to be done with the assistance of a government, and at the time we did not have a government who was interested. We now have a generous and hyperactive Labour government that wants to make sure that the properties in places like Islington, social housing properties in places like Islington, are brought up to a decent home standard. When we were elected in '97, only 25% of the housing in Islington, social housing in Islington, was at decent home standard. We are now investing £157 million in doing up the social housing in Islington so that it is something that we can be proud of and our people can be proud of living there. It is a good thing for us to be doing. The difficulty is that those who are being caught in the fire on this are the leaseholders, those who have bought their social housing because they thought that it was the right thing to do and are now being hammered by huge bills. And our properties are split in the way that I began when I began this speech into, on the whole, street properties and now accommodation which is run by Homes for Islington, which is an ALMO. And the difficulty is that the law says that when the street properties are done up, and they're done up under the Private Finance Initiative, they have to be capped at £10,000. And it wouldn't be a caricature to say that a number of the leaseholders who live in the streets are quite often professional couples who have bought from original right to buyers, and they are now benefiting from living in a flat in a Georgian Square bought originally by Margaret Hodge. And they're now being, when their properties are being done up, they're being done up and they're only having to pay £10,000. Whereas the pensioners, who are the original right to buyers, who are living on the estates, are being charged limitless amounts of money. And it is terrifying and it is fundamentally unfair. And really, my first thing that I would ask today is that the government seriously considers adding ALMO to a little bit of legislation. The Social Landlord's Mandatory Reduction of Service Charges 1997 says that you can, if your property is being done up under the Single Regeneration Budget, the SRB, or the Estates Renewal Challenge Fund, the ERCF, why can't we also have ALMO? If you could just add ALMO, then the people on my estates could have the leaseholders could have the amount of money they're being charged capped at £10,000. Because at the moment, we are getting enormous injustices. Yes, of course.
Very much, in completely agreeing with what she's saying, does she also recognise, however, that any cost of applying the cap shouldn't benefit companies, and that also the cost of the cap shouldn't be falling upon tenants because it is ring-fenced within the housing revenue account? If a local authority chooses to fund a cap in that way, that resource has to be found other than from the pockets of local authority tenants.
Emily Thornbury.
Yes, and I think that is also, I think that we should be looking at that, and I think that we should be looking at a number of other things. I mean, may I say that I wrote to the 80 leaseholders who had originally written to me about issues, and I sent them a survey. I sent out 80, and I don't know if any politician has ever had this. You send out 80 surveys, and guess how many I got back? I got 80. And I asked them questions about hardship, and I asked them questions about whether they felt they'd been consulted, and I asked them questions about fairness, and I have sent the results to the department. I then wrote to more leaseholders, and I've pruned out those who weren't as perhaps as disciplined as I wanted them to be in terms of answering particular questions. And I've sent the department 134 cases from Islington about hardship that they have suffered and the difficulties that leaseholders in Islington are. And I know that the department is reviewing the effect of decent homes on leaseholders, and I certainly hope that the experiences of the Islington leaseholders that I have sent to them is something that the department will take very seriously and will be something that hopefully will inform decisions that will be made, because something must be done. Something must be done.